You play sports long enough, you're gonna get injured. In my career, 2 injuries. One separated shoulder from being hit from behind, and a fractured wrist from taking a slap shot from 10 feet away. It comes with the territory, but it doesn't make it any easier when you know it's gonna happen. The rehab and the process of going through dealing with that injury is challenging. You actually literally go through the stages of grief when you undergo an injury, of anger, of denial of how bad it might be, of depression, of bargaining with the doctor or with your coach of your team to try to get back sooner, and then acceptance of the reality. Sports injury is a lot like our self-isolation. And even though we are trending on an upswing now, we still got a little ways to go before we come back to some form of normal. So how does dealing with injury in sports help us to understand how we work through this self-isolation, which is not normal and not much fun? First, we can't do it alone. Even in self-isolation, there's no way we can go completely isolated for any length of time. We need others. When you're rehabbing an injury, you don't rehab it by yourself. You need to go see a doctor. You might need physiotherapy. If you've got a bum limb, you might need people to help you get dressed or to make food, to do simple tasks that you can't do anymore. You can't rehab, you can't recover on your own. In isolation, it's the same thing. We cannot live this alone. And so we need to learn, one, for those of us that are living with other people, to learn how to lean on them anew. Just because you lived with your family doesn't mean that you've learned how to be open and vulnerable to them and to be dependent on them. Sometimes you're stuck in the role of the provider all the time. Well, now you need them because you can't just fill that role anymore. How do we reach out to those who might be more isolated than we are, especially our seniors that are living alone and are the most vulnerable population through the midst of all this? How do we reach out to be a help and a support for others? This is a real mental and emotional grind. Because when your physical abilities are taken away in injury, you're left with your thoughts for so much more time. And for some people, that is a scary prospect. In self-isolation, with our freedoms being taken away of what we can do and how we can fill our time, especially in our leisure, we're stuck in our head so much more. And that can be really challenging, which is why we're seeing in the midst of this time of self-isolation, problems with addictions going up, family violence increasing, because it creates that greater interior tension. So to first acknowledge that I can't just go about my life as usual. I need to learn how to work through the anguish, the anger, the depression that might come from this isolation, recognizing that interior struggle to be able to move forward. In St. Paul's letter to the Romans, he says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but allow your minds to be transformed, to discern the will of God for what is good and perfect and true." Taking away some of these physical freedoms allows us to enter into that struggle with Christ and not alone. Then all of the work of rehab. Nobody rehabs in a week. It's a lengthy process, and the perseverance that it requires in order to stay diligent through that, to not lose hope, to stay faithful to the task at hand, and not to get detracted, not to feel sorry for ourselves. It's real suffering, not just in the injury itself, but in the rehab, there's suffering in order to heal. We're in the midst of that. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that every one of us has something that we need healing for in our life. Maybe this is an opportunity for that. But in order for that to happen, we have to be willing to accept and embrace the suffering that comes to grow towards that healing. In the letter to the Hebrews, the author tells us to endure trials for the sake of discipline, that nobody likes to be punished when it happens. But when we see the fruit of what comes from it, then we're willing to undergo it. That we get trained by this discipline, by this suffering, for the sake of what comes from it. And I think that's important to hold on to right now, that what we are enduring now will bear fruit if we accept and don't reject the suffering that we're experiencing now. And finally, I think one of the hardest things with any injury, with what we're living now, is the unknown. The unknown of what it's going to take to rehab, and the unknown of, can I fully come back to what I had before? We don't know. We don't know how to walk through this. We don't know what's waiting for us on the other side. And that can increase our frustration and increase our anxiety because of it. Because the reality with dealing with injury, walking through that experience, is you don't really see the fruit of all of it until after it's done. And to see how scar tissue might have healed what was broken before. There's a goaltender from the Boston Bruins from the 1970s named Jerry Cheevers, back when the goalies were just starting to wear face masks to play. And what he started doing was every time he took a puck off the face, he drew a stitch mark on his mask as a reminder that this is where he would have been injured had he not been wearing the face mask. And by the end of his career, the entire mask was full of stitch marks, and he was the first goalie to paint his mask. But a reminder of the healing that takes place. A great saint from the last century, Chiara Badano from Italy, died at just 18 years old of bone cancer, which people tell me is one of the most painful forms of cancer that you can experience. But by her witness, she showed how suffering actually brought her deeper faith and helped heal people around her, even though she was the one that was suffering. She allowed this experience to draw her deeper into relationship with Christ. That her loneliness that could have been experienced through her illness, she recognized that she could live the will of Jesus in her life through her suffering, that it gave purpose to what she was living, to live for others. And she did everything that she could to serve the youth of her community even while she was sick, living her life for others. That the mental anguish that can come with suffering and with illness, she actually rejected pain medication because she found that it clouded her mind and that she couldn't keep her attention fixated on Jesus through the pain if she took the medications. She recognized that Christ suffered on the cross for her and suffered with her through that illness. And then the unknown of what happens through illness and the outcome of it all, she held on to the hope of her faith, the assurance of heaven that would come after, to the point where the last words that she spoke on her deathbed are, "Be happy, because I am happy." This is the great healing and joy that can come from our Christian faith through difficult times. But we have to face it, and we have to embrace it. We can't run from it. We have to accept whatever loneliness might come, but recognize that Christ becomes more present to us in those moments and invite him into that. But that allows us to turn interiorly, to deepen our life of prayer, which when preoccupied with the world makes it difficult to do. Christ suffers for us and with us. And so we embrace the experience of rehabilitation because through it we become Christ-like.